Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. And yeah, there are lots of areas that we've worked on in the past, and I think some of the more recent topics are really quite current and relate to emerging substances in the environment, or those substances which we have less knowledge about, and essentially trying to understand the sources and pathway relationship that lead to exposure of whatever part of the environment, whether it's humans or parts of the ecosystem. So some areas, a couple of areas I think we could perhaps pick out. First one is the potential for rare earth elements in society to become more prevalent, and as we use more and more digital devices, and disposal of those digital devices becomes more widespread, and also medical technology which uses rare earth elements becomes increasingly a burden on the wider environment. We need to have a better understanding of the potential risk to human health from some of these rare earth elements. And we have some work that's been undertaken in our partner institutions in Germany looking at the ecotoxicology of, in particular, lanthanum and gadolinium as key markers. And what is very clear about this is that the conventional tests for establishing protective limits in the environment really need to be very carefully undertaken, because the pathway of these elements is quite variable and very sensitive to chemical reactions that precipitate or exclude what we expect the dose levels to be from the test animals. And we've been able to look at the pathways of these elements into and onto the organisms, and see very big differences in the individual elements in the way that they are taken up into the organism. So either as a competitor for things like calcium, or as precipitates in attached to food that's being consumed. So our understanding of the toxic effect and the response and dose is really challenged. And that is really quite a challenge for us in the future. I think there's a lot more work being undertaken, and we're at the start of a very important journey in that area. And we need more sophisticated techniques, which we're applying at various research institutes. Other areas, perhaps a bit more practical and pragmatic in terms of waste management, in particular waste electronics and electrical items, and the plastics associated with those devices are particularly of interest across industry. And from an academic perspective, it's really the control of hazardous materials that are used to control the hazard from the electronics. So flame retardants as a particular class of materials. And what we've been doing more recently is working with industry, with waste management and device recycling companies to understand the significance of these flame retardants within the stock of electronic devices. And you find that it is very variable in terms of its abundance or their abundance, and it is also unevenly distributed in devices as well. So the result of this is that whilst we need to control the hazardous materials are not consistently dispersed in those artifacts. So we can look at developing methods to screen out the less contaminated or uncontaminated materials and reuse them. So without having to send all plastic for incineration, we can identify where the high levels of brominated flame retardants are and control that material and release up to 70% of the plastic for reuse, which is a great environmental improvement. And we were only able to do that by developing good screening techniques to identify these substances. And I guess sort of other areas that I can just mention briefly include how, for example, contamination in the environment affects challenging issues, emerging issues such as antimicrobial resistance, which is a major issue for society globally. And there are studies in our group on the impact of historical discharges of contamination on AMR in the wider environment, but also discharges of treated pharmaceutical wastes into the environment and their impact. And that is work that's in progress, and with other groups, hopefully we can provide some important knowledge in terms of how to manage and look forward to trying to improve our environmental quality. I think the biggest challenge for any research scientist is, particularly in this area, looking at chemical materials in the environment, is the increasing requirement for more analytical data, for more information, and measurements of a broader range of samples, and statistically increase the data that we generate, and that requires obviously a lot of analytical resource, but it also requires you to establish good quality assurance and quality control strategies for your analytical work. And so that is a big challenge for us in terms of being able to deliver projects quickly. So we need to make sure that we have robust methods. And as we get more complicated sort of exposures in terms of the cocktail of chemicals, then we have to have more diverse measurement systems, and that is a big challenge for us. In one place to have all of the facilities is always difficult. So to get round, or to address that, not get round it, but to deal with that challenge, collaboration is very important, and building research teams across organizations where resources and specialisms in terms of analysis can be brought to the particular topic that you're interested in, but also perhaps looking at simplifying the analysis and using techniques that help you to screen your samples to allow you to focus on areas where you need more detailed analysis. So those challenges can be addressed in a more effective way. I hope then that as we approach the problems, the scientific questions that we ask, we do share those problems with emerging young researchers, training and scientific techniques, so that they carry forward and generate information that's reliable, useful, to allow the science to move forward, but also to allow the application of the science to move forward is the most important thing. So I'm very supportive of collaboration within organizations, between organizations, and between countries, where specialities can be shared and training can be given for young researchers. That's a really great question, and something that made me think very deeply about the challenge that we face. And I guess exposure science is about the sort of the source, the pathway receptor, the conventional risk assessment model that we often use to frame our work. But I guess the big issue that I think is perhaps less well appreciated or studied is the big issue of climate change. How climate change will impact on the work environmental exposure scientists undertake. So that, I feel, is probably in many areas of of interaction with our subject. So changing climatic conditions change the pathways to an extent, affect the transfer of contaminants within the environment. We have more extreme events, and so the conditions under which we monitor and assess that transport will vary quite a lot. That also will impact on how materials are released into the environment at the beginning, if you like, of that chain of relationships, and ultimately it also affects how humans behave. And this, I think, is a really critical area to consider in the future. And human behavior leads to the exposure aspect for the human receptor, and we change our behaviors as a result of a number of different external factors. And so the opportunity to keep at the right temperature, not too hot, not too cold, in a comfortable environment where we feel safe, means that our indoor environments where we use them change in terms of their composition, and how the changing climate conditions might affect that. So the indoor environment, perhaps in terms of air exchange, temperature and moisture conditions, will influence how chemical substances are then interacting with humans, and how those exposures take place. So I think that aspect needs to perhaps be highlighted as a fundamental driver, because environmental conditions are not constant, and I guess a lot of our assessment work has been performed under modeled or general scenarios, and those scenarios we know now are very different from perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I'm not saying that we have a major reworking to do with all our science, but we need to perhaps consider how it could impact on what we are studying, and what the implications might be for 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 years time, because of that dynamic. And so that as the main driver then leads to consider how we then look at other aspects of exposure as a result of food chain, and the indoor environment, and our very different social and cultural habits. Yeah, well, this, I guess, it extends some of the comments I've already made, and the Protracted Crisis Research Centre in my university is a research group, research focus in our School of Social Sciences, and my interest is very much in how this research study area could be supported by environmental science, and I guess the interest from a social science perspective is very much about the drivers of migration, conflict, climate change, etc., and the availability of resources such as water and food affects significant populations around the globe, whether it's through conflict driven or climate driven, or other social factors. And in that process taking place, then individuals find themselves in very different environmental conditions, obviously, often without very good sanitation, and we are, frequently aware of those challenges from the media, of different crises around the world, but also from perhaps an exposure science perspective, that these groups may find that they are forced to live and exist in environments that also are chemically quite poor, or exposed to waste materials, or through perhaps informal industry, through informal recycling, handle materials that are potentially or contain potentially harmful substances, and those exposures then become a critical part of their health and sort of protection, or need for health protection. So trying to add the sort of exposure scientists' view on the challenges that managing or trying to address these societal problems of crises around the world is an important an increasingly important contribution that we can make to try to help and improve the circumstances of these groups. So that's really why I continue to be involved, and are encouraged to be involved with this type of group. It's not necessarily the type of group an environmental scientist might expect to be associated with, but I find it gives us an opportunity to contribute more to support better understanding, and perhaps then better management or adaptation strategies to the driving forces for protracted crises and impacts on human populations. Yeah, certainly. I'm also conscious that, you know, as a scientist, as an academic, the generation of high quality publications and training our emerging researchers and our emerging academics in publishing high quality contributions to the scientific literature is extremely important. So I've always been committed to the publishing process as a reviewer, and perhaps more recently as a member of various editorial boards. And the editorial boards that I'm involved with cover a number of chemical sciences, environmental sciences, and waste and resource management areas, both from a fundamental earth science to a very applied industrial perspective. And that's hard work. It's good to be involved, but what it provides for me is an understanding of the focus of the community, the academic publishing community, the topics that are emerging that groups have identified as being important, but also in terms of how, as an editor or a reviewer, you can help those submitting their papers for publication to improve their publications, to think about the way their approach is being presented, and how it could be better presented to demonstrate the contribution that the researchers could make to the subject. Sometimes it's easy to perhaps see a way of revising the manuscript. Sometimes it's quite frustrating to see a study that perhaps should have included other aspects that would have made it much more robust and much more impactful. So I've been very enthusiastic about how I feed that back to the authors in both as a reviewer, and then latterly perhaps more as an editorial board member. And an editorial board membership and my role as editor-in-chief for one journal in Earth Sciences gives also important obligations to the community that you need to approach how you encourage publication in a fair and consistent manner. You need to be honest about the contribution, and also guard against some of the poor practice that often is seen in publications that aren't carefully put together, and feed that back to the author and the author team. Sometimes with quite a bit of explanation, and sometimes with some firm decision making that may not be well received by those potential authors. So that process then also, I can't remove that from how it affects how I work with my research group and collaborators in terms of our research projects. So being very thoughtful and careful about how we collect and present information, so that our message comes across as clearly as possible, and our work is trusted as a contribution. Yes, certainly I can make some observations, but first of all, I'd like to thank you and the editorial team for the invitation to join with you, and I'm pleased to accept and pleased to see the progress that's already been made by the journal. Having worked as a reviewer for the journal already, I can see the type of articles that are being submitted and accepted, and there's some really interesting contributions that have already been published. So I think there is a very good start for the journal, and I'm quite excited for the future development. And I think the work so far should be continued. I think the editorial process, the review process, is very robust and is totally appropriate to a world-leading publication as the journal progresses. I think the emphasis within the journal should always, and is always, focused on the quality of the data that is behind the manuscript and the story that the authors want to tell, and that should always be emphasized and always be highlighted as a core element. And I think that will then demonstrate the focus of the journal, and its credibility is then is well established. And along with that, because exposure science is a tricky topic to try to research and produce contributions, because quite often the opportunity to collect data is quite short. Studies need to be robust and need to be reproducible, but sometimes exposure conditions can be difficult to engage with and collect reliable information. So I think emphasizing that reproducibility where possible, but also emphasizing perhaps the interest that the journal might have in innovative ways of collecting data, so that we can improve our understanding. So methodologies and sampling of critical groups in society, perhaps, or parts of the ecosystem, using innovative measurement techniques and sort of markers of exposure in whatever population you're looking at is also important as a driver, and not forgetting that the outcomes from the work being published will have relevance to society, and also perhaps emphasizing the implications of the work for society should also be part of the sort of presentation of results and discussion of their implications, even if it is novel techniques, even if it is focused on very restricted applications, then it should be expanded on a little bit and reflected on as part of the journal's contribution to the science in this area.